On the night of July 14, 1971, three men left a small roadside bar in Western Virginia and drove home believing the incident was over. By the end of the next 2 days, 11 men were dead across forests, dirt roads, barns and riverbanks scattered through the county. All adults, all locals, all connected to a single place, a single night, and a chain of decisions that escalated faster than anyone expected. The perpetrators were not a gang, not an organization, not law enforcement. They were three brothers, a fatherless household raised on the edge of town, men who had never claimed power, territory, or influence, and never imagined they would become the center of the largest manhunt the region had ever seen. Authorities would later describe it as a series of unrelated homicides. Residents called it something else entirely, the Virginia Massacre. But the cause wasn't drugs, wasn't money, wasn't an ongoing feud. It began with a moment of racism inside a bar, a laugh that carried too far, and a silence that gave permission. Before we continue with the video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In the summer of 1971, Western Virginia still moved at the pace of habit. Nothing happened fast there. Not justice, not change, not memory. The roads were narrow and cracked, carved through forests that swallowed sound and light with equal ease. Towns were small enough that everyone knew where you belonged, and more importantly, where you didn't. On the edge of one of those towns stood a roadside bar with no sign and no history anyone wanted to claim. It was the kind of place that survived by being forgotten. No windows facing the road, one flickering light above the door. Inside, the air smelled of beer soaked into old wood and cigarettes crushed into the floorboards years earlier. That night, three brothers walked in together. They were known locally as the Hawkins brothers. Not famous, not feared, just known. Their family had lived outside town limits for years, in a sagging house near the tree line, where the forest began, and rules became less clear. Their father had died young. Their mother worked until her body failed. The brothers learned early to stay quiet, to move carefully, to never give anyone a reason. They did everything right. They ordered drinks. They kept their eyes down. They didn't speak louder than necessary, but it didn't matter. It never did. Someone laughed first. It wasn't loud, just enough to be noticed. Then another voice joined in, followed by the scrape of a chair and the deliberate clearing of a throat, the kind that signals authority without ever saying it outright. The bartender didn't look at them when he spoke. "You boys know this ain't your place." The room went still, not silent. Breathing still happened. Glasses still clinked, but attentive, waiting. One of the brothers started to say something. Not an argument, not a threat. Just a sentence meant to soften the moment, to let everyone leave with dignity intact. He didn't finish it. A bottle shattered against the wall behind them, spraying glass across the floor like sparks. Laughter followed. Short, sharp, controlled. Someone said a word that wouldn't make it into any police report. Someone else repeated it. What happened next would later be described as an altercation. But no punches were thrown. No knives pulled, no weapons shown. They were escorted out, hands on shoulders, pressure just firm enough to hurt. The door slammed behind them, cutting off the noise and the heat and the smell of alcohol in one clean motion. Outside, the night was thick and heavy. Crickets screamed from the trees. The gravel lot crunched under their shoes as they stood there for a moment longer than necessary. One of the brothers bent down and picked up a shard of glass that had followed them outside, stuck to the cuff of his boot. He turned it in his fingers, watching how the light caught on its edge. No one spoke. They didn't argue. They didn't shout back. They didn't threaten anyone through the door. They walked. The drive home took 12 minutes. No music, no conversation, just the sound of tires on dirt and the steady rhythm of breathing. When they reached the house, the oldest brother shut off the engine but didn't get out. He stared through the windshield at the dark outline of the trees. "They think that was it," he said. The middle brother nodded once. The youngest didn't speak at all. Inside the house, they didn't turn on the lights. They moved through the rooms by memory, floorboards that creaked, doors that stuck. A kitchen table scarred with years of use. In a locked cabinet beneath the sink were firearms that hadn't been touched in months, not hidden, not polished, just waiting. This wasn't rage. It wasn't a sudden snap or a drunken decision. What moved through that house that night was something colder, older, something built slowly, piece by piece, across years of being watched, dismissed, and warned without words. They didn't talk about revenge. They talked about names, who had been there, who had laughed, who had followed them outside, who had said nothing when it mattered. By the time the sun began to rise over the trees, the Hawkins brothers were no longer just three men who had been humiliated in a bar. They were hunters with a list, and the men on that list had no idea that, before another night fell, they would be running through the same woods they had once believed belonged only to them. The first man died less than 2 miles from his own house. His name would appear in the local paper 2 days later, misspelled once and shortened twice. But that morning, he was just a shape lying face down among wet leaves and broken branches. His boots still pointed toward the dirt road he never reached. He had been drinking the night before, not enough to stumble, but enough to feel loose, enough to laugh louder than usual, enough to follow 3 men outside a bar just to see how fast they would leave. When he drove home, he took the long way. Everyone did sometimes. The forest roads were quiet, familiar, and forgiving if you knew them well. He rolled down the window, letting the night air cut through the smell of alcohol. That was when he noticed the headlights behind him. They stayed far enough back to feel accidental, close enough to be intentional. He turned once, then again. The car followed. By the time he realized what was happening, the road had narrowed, trees closing in so tightly that the sky disappeared above him. He sped up. So did the headlights. He never saw who fired first. The shot echoed once, sharp and clean, then vanished into the woods like it had never happened. His car lurched, tires slipping off the road, metal folding into dirt and roots. By the time he crawled out, dazed and bleeding, the headlights were gone. The woods were silent again. He ran. He didn't know where he was running, only that staying still felt worse. Branches tore at his clothes. His breath came in loud, panicked bursts. Somewhere behind him, a twig snapped, then another. They didn't rush him. That was the part no one would ever understand. They let him exhaust himself, let fear do most of the work. When he finally tripped and fell near the creek, hands shaking too badly to push himself back up, they were already close enough to hear him crying. One shot ended it. By sunrise, his body was cold. The sheriff's department found him hours later after a hunter reported a crashed car and followed the trail of disturbed leaves. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, just another dead man in the woods. But by noon, whispers had started. By evening, they had spread. The second man disappeared that same night. He never made it home from work. His truck was found abandoned near an old barn. Door open, engine cold, no blood, no sign of a struggle. Just footprints leading away from the road, and then nothing. The third died before dawn, shot once while trying to cross a shallow river, water still rippling around his body when he was found. He had been one of the loudest voices in the bar, the kind of man who never believed consequences were real until they touched him. By then, the pattern was impossible to ignore. All 3 men had been at the bar. All 3 had followed the brothers outside. All 3 were dead. The town responded the only way it knew how. It locked its doors. Men who had laughed 2 nights earlier now refused to leave their houses after dark. Trucks that once filled the bar's parking lot stayed parked. The bartender closed early and claimed plumbing issues. The sheriff requested assistance from the state police, but quietly, no announcements, no press statements. He knew what panic looked like in small towns, and he knew how fast it could turn ugly. What no one knew, what no one even considered, was that the brothers were moving with discipline. They didn't stay together for long. They split, regrouped, used back roads and footpaths their family had walked for decades. They slept in short shifts, ate cold food, spoke only when necessary. Each name on the list was checked off only after confirmation. No mistakes. By the 4th body, fear had turned into something heavier. Men started traveling in groups. Firearms appeared in truck racks. Porch lights stayed on all night. The woods, once familiar, now felt like a trap. But weapons didn't help. The 5th man fired wildly into the trees after hearing movement behind him. He hit nothing. A single, controlled shot dropped him where he stood. The 6th tried to hide in his cousin's house. He never made it past the porch. By the end of the second night, 6 men were dead, and the brothers still hadn't been seen. State police arrived at dawn on the 3rd day. Roadblocks were set. Searches organized. Helicopters requested. Too late. The Hawkins brothers had already moved past the point of stopping because the list wasn't finished, and the woods were still quiet enough to hide 5 more bodies. By the 3rd morning, Western Virginia felt like it had stopped breathing. The roads were still there. The trees still stood. The sun still rose the way it always had. But the space between those things felt different, tighter, heavier, as if the land itself was waiting for something else to happen. 6 bodies were already too many for a town that rarely saw one. State police cars lined the main road, their presence awkward and unfamiliar. Men who had grown up believing they understood their surroundings now avoided eye contact with the woods. Conversations happened in whispers. Windows stayed covered. Guns were cleaned not out of confidence, but out of fear. No one said the brother's name out loud. Officially, there were no suspects, just persons of interest and ongoing investigations. But everyone knew. They knew because the dead men shared a single night, a single place, a single moment that had been dismissed as nothing. The sheriff held a closed-door meeting at the town hall. Farmers, shop owners, and church elders crowded into folding chairs, their hats in their hands. He told them to stay calm, to report anything unusual, to avoid speculation. No one believed him. A man stood and asked the question that had been hanging in the air since the first body was found. "Are we being hunted?" The sheriff didn't answer immediately. That silence was enough. That afternoon, the 7th man made a mistake. He believed safety came from familiarity. He took the same shortcut he'd driven 100 times before, a narrow road that cut between 2 hills and disappeared into thick forest for nearly a mile. He drove fast, eyes fixed ahead, knuckles white on the steering wheel. He never noticed the absence of birds. The shot shattered his windshield before he could brake. His truck slammed into a tree, horn blaring uselessly into the woods. He died slumped forward, hands still gripping the wheel. The 8th man died less than an hour later. He was armed, prepared, surrounded by friends. It didn't matter. He stepped outside to smoke, just far enough from the porch light that his silhouette blurred into the dark. A single shot took him in the chest. His friends ran out too late, firing wildly into the night, shouting names that didn't answer back. By nightfall, 8 men were dead. The town crossed an invisible line. People stopped pretending this would end on its own. They demanded arrests, demanded protection, demanded answers that didn't exist. The state police expanded the search radius. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters circled low, their blades chopping the air above the trees. They found nothing, because the brothers weren't hiding anymore. They were moving faster. The 9th man tried to leave town. He packed his truck before sunrise, told his wife he was visiting family, and promised to be back before the weekend. He never made it past the county line. His body was found in a ditch, eyes open, staring at the sky. That night, the 10th man barricaded himself inside his house. He had been at the bar. He had laughed. He had followed them outside and said nothing when it counted. Now he sat alone in his living room, shotgun across his knees, television flickering silently. The power went out at 2:13 a.m. The house went dark. Neighbors heard the gunshot, but didn't come outside. By dawn, 10 men were dead. The sheriff officially declared a curfew. Churches opened their doors for prayer meetings that filled faster than Sunday service ever had. Old arguments were forgotten. Old grudges were set aside. Fear flattened everything into a single shared emotion. And still, one name remained, the 11th man. He had been the loudest voice that night, the one others followed, the one who had decided it was time for the brothers to leave. He knew they were coming. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He kept his rifle close and his lights on. He listened to every sound the house made, every shift of wood, every gust of wind against the windows. At 3:41 a.m., the lights went out. At 3:44, something tapped against the back door. Not hard, not urgent, deliberate. The town would wake up soon. The sun would rise, and whatever was happening would finally be over. But in that house, alone and shaking, the 11th man realized something too late. This had never been about escape. It was about completion. The 11th man had not always been brave. He had been loud. That night at the bar, loud had passed for courage. Loud had drawn smiles, nods, approval from the men around him. Loud had made him feel untouchable. Now, in the dark of his own house, Loud was gone. The power outage had swallowed the familiar hum of appliances, replacing it with a silence so complete it rang in his ears. He stood in the hallway, rifle pressed against his shoulder, sweat running down his spine despite the cool night air. The tap came again, not on the door, on the glass, slow, controlled, as if whoever stood outside knew exactly where he was. He didn't shout, didn't warn. He moved backward instead, step by careful step, until his calves hit the edge of the couch. His breathing grew shallow. Every shadow in the room stretched into something threatening. He had planned for this. He told himself that. He had lights, locks, a gun. He had friends. He had the law. None of it mattered now. The back door opened without force. No kick, no crash, just the soft click of a latch turning. Footsteps crossed the kitchen. 3 sets. He fired once. The shot tore through the doorway, splintering wood, echoing down the empty hallway. He fired again and again, each shot louder than the last, each one revealing more of the room in violent flashes of light. Silence answered him. Then a voice spoke from somewhere he couldn't see. "You remember us." It wasn't shouted, it wasn't angry, it was steady. He turned too fast. The blow knocked the rifle from his hands. He fell hard, breath leaving his lungs in a sharp gasp. Before he could move, a boot pressed into his chest, pinning him to the floor. He looked up. The brothers stood over him, faces calm, eyes clear. No masks, no hesitation. They wanted him to see them. "I didn't do anything," he said. The words rushed out, thin and useless. "I didn't touch you. I didn't—" The oldest brother crouched beside him. "You laughed," he said, "and you told them to keep going." The man shook his head, tears spilling down the sides of his face. "It was nothing," he whispered, "just words." The youngest brother stepped forward. "So was this," he said. The gunshot ended it. Neighbors heard it. They stayed inside. By the time the sheriff arrived, the house was empty again. The body lay in the living room, lights still off, the television frozen on a bright, meaningless image. 11 names, completed. The search intensified after that. Roadblocks tightened. State police doubled patrols. Federal agents were quietly alerted, though no one wanted to admit it out loud. The Hawkins brothers were gone. Their house near the tree line was found abandoned. No food, no weapons, no sign of struggle. Just dust, silence, and 3 empty rooms that looked like no one planned to return. Days passed, then weeks. The case stalled. Officially, the massacre remained unsolved. No arrests, no charges, no closure. Files thickened with theories that went nowhere. Leads dried up. Witnesses forgot details or never remembered them clearly in the first place. The town changed anyway. The bar closed within a month. Its windows were boarded up, the sign removed. No one claimed responsibility. No one asked why. Men stopped following others outside at night. Jokes went unfinished. Laughter came softer. Some families moved away. Others stayed and pretended nothing had happened. But the woods remembered. Hunters avoided certain trails. Farmers swore they felt watched near the old dirt roads. Parents warned their sons to be careful with their words, even when they thought no one was listening. And every summer, when the heat pressed down just right, someone would bring it up in a low voice. The year the rules failed. The year no one was safe behind familiarity. The year 11 men learned that silence, laughter, and looking away could still make you a target. The Hawkins brothers were never seen again in Virginia. Some said they crossed state lines. Others claimed they went deeper into the mountains, living off land no one else dared to enter. A few insisted they were dead within a year, victims of their own choices. There were no records to confirm any of it, only absence, and an understanding that spread quietly through the region, that what happened wasn't random, it wasn't madness, it wasn't chaos. It was a response, measured, deliberate, final. The state closed the case in the late 1970s, labeling it an unresolved series of homicides with no remaining leads. But the people who lived there didn't call it that. They called it a warning. When the bodies stopped appearing, the town didn't relax. It stiffened. For weeks, people had lived braced for impact, waiting for the next knock, the next siren, the next name whispered through a screen door. Fear had been sharp, immediate, exhausting. When it vanished overnight, it left behind something heavier. Suspicion. Men watched each other too closely. Old friendships strained under questions no one dared to ask. Who knew something? Who had seen something? Who had helped without meaning to? Funerals were held quietly, not together, not publicly. 11 separate gatherings, each one small, controlled and tense. There were no speeches about innocence, no demands for justice, just tight faces and quick exits. No one wanted to be remembered as loud. The sheriff filed his final report in stages. He listed times, locations, ballistics. He used phrases like unknown assailants and no conclusive evidence. The truth was simpler. The investigation had nowhere left to go. Witnesses had seen nothing. Vehicles had been wiped clean. Trails vanished into forests that refused to give anything back. The state police stayed another month, then 2, then quietly withdrew. Roadblocks disappeared. Helicopters stopped flying. The dogs were taken home. Life resumed, not normally but functionally. The bar never reopened. Someone bought the land and left it empty. Weeds grew where cars once parked. Teenagers avoided it, not out of fear, but out of instinct. Children heard the story before they understood it, not as a lesson, as a boundary. Parents warned their sons to watch their mouths, to think before laughing, to remember that some things don't disappear just because they're common. No one said the brothers' names, but everyone knew them. A year later, a man from out of state tried to write about what happened. He came asking questions, flipping open a notebook too quickly, speaking too confidently. He stayed 3 days. On the 4th, he left without publishing a word. Some stories, he learned, don't want witnesses. Rumors replaced facts. Someone claimed the brothers were spotted in Tennessee. Another swore he saw one of them working under a different name in Ohio. A truck driver insisted he shared a meal with one in West Virginia years later and recognized the eyes. Nothing stuck. The files gathered dust, but the impact didn't fade. Arguments de-escalated faster. Men walked away from confrontations that once would have turned physical. The invisible line that had governed behavior before 1971 shifted slightly. Not erased, not corrected, but noticed. The woods became neutral ground, not owned, not conquered, not safe. In quiet moments, people replayed that night in their heads. The laughter, the bottle, the moment where nothing had seemed important enough to stop. That was the part that lingered. Not the violence, but the ease that came before it. The idea that something irreversible could begin without raising a voice. Years later, a new sheriff took office. He reviewed the old case out of obligation more than hope. He read every report, every statement, every contradictory timeline. At the end, he closed the folder and locked it away. There was nothing left to solve. The Hawkins house eventually collapsed. Nature reclaimed it the way it always does, quietly, without commentary. The trees crept closer. The road leading to it faded into undergrowth. By the early 1980s, new families moved into the area. They heard vague references, incomplete warnings, a sense that certain subjects ended conversations abruptly. They learned. Everyone did. Because the massacre didn't end in 1971, it settled. It became part of the environment, like humidity, like distance, like the knowledge that some reactions are stored, not forgotten. And when people spoke about it decades later, they didn't talk about the brothers as monsters. They talked about sequence, about how things line up, about how permission spreads, about how silence teaches people what they're allowed to do. The bodies were counted, the case was closed, but the memories stayed open. No law was passed after 1971, no speeches were given, no plaques were installed, no anniversaries were marked. Officially, nothing changed, and yet everything did. The rule that shifted that year never appeared in writing. It wasn't voted on or enforced by anyone in uniform. It spread the way instinct spreads, quietly, through observation, through consequence. People learned what the land had already known, that certain actions don't need witnesses to be remembered, that some lines, once crossed, redraw themselves permanently. In the years that followed, the town grew cautious in a way that felt unnatural to outsiders. Arguments ended faster. Confrontations dissolved before they formed. Men who once filled space with confidence now measured it carefully, not because they had become kinder, but because they had become aware. Awareness does that. Children who hadn't been born in 1971 grew up hearing fragments of the story, not details, not names, just the shape of it, a warning without explanation. Don't push when you don't need to. Don't laugh when someone is cornered. Don't assume silence means acceptance. The woods stayed the same, but people didn't walk them the same way. Trails were taken seriously. Darkness was respected. The idea that familiarity equals safety no longer held. Every so often, someone would ask the question out loud. Were they right? The question never lasted long, because right and wrong had never been the point. What happened in Western Virginia wasn't remembered as justice. It wasn't remembered as vengeance either. It was remembered as inevitability, the moment when a long, ignored pressure finally found release. The brothers were never turned into legends. No songs, no myths, no heroic retellings. They remained what they had always been, men who responded. That distinction mattered. Years later, one of the state investigators would admit, off record, that the case was closed not because it was unsolvable, but because reopening it felt pointless. You don't investigate a boundary, he said, you notice it. By the late 1980s, people spoke more carefully in that region than neighboring towns ever did. Outsiders sometimes mistook it for politeness. It wasn't. It was calibration. A quiet understanding that some reactions don't announce themselves. They arrive prepared. They arrive informed. And they don't need to explain why. The massacre never received a single official name. Newspapers avoided revisiting it. Archives listed it under dry classifications. Students studying regional history skimmed past it, drawn instead to safer events with cleaner conclusions. But those who lived there knew better. They knew that the most lasting change rarely comes from laws or courts. It comes from memory, from knowing deep down that a line once dismissed as harmless laughter had proven capable of ending lives. 11 of them. The brothers were never found. That absence became part of the story too, not as mystery, but as closure. Because sometimes, the disappearance of an answer is the answer. People stopped asking who they were, stopped asking where they went. Those questions didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what remained. A town that learned restraint without being taught. A region that adjusted behavior without instruction. A generation that understood consequence without ever seeing it firsthand. 1971 didn't change Virginia because of violence. It changed it because of sequence. Because everyone saw how easily one thing led to another. How laughter became pursuit. How dismissal became planning. How planning became silence. And silence became 11 graves. No law changed. No rule was written, but everyone followed it, and they still do. Years passed, and the land absorbed what had happened the way it absorbs everything else, slowly, without ceremony. By the mid-1970s, the roads where the bodies had been found were paved over or rerouted. The barns collapsed or were torn down. Trees grew thicker where search parties once walked in lines, calling names that never answered back. To anyone passing through, Western Virginia looked unchanged, quiet, rural, ordinary. But those who lived there knew the difference. They felt it in the way conversations ended early, in how eyes lingered a moment longer before trust formed, in the way certain jokes no longer landed, hanging in the air until someone cleared their throat and moved on. The massacre had not become legend. Legends require distance, exaggeration, a willingness to romanticize. This story resisted that. It stayed practical, close to the ground, too real to polish. 11 men had died in less than 3 days. 3 men had vanished, and an entire region had adjusted without ever announcing that it had done so. The official case file grew cold quickly. Detectives rotated out. Leads were reclassified, downgraded, forgotten. When the final review came, the conclusion was procedural and bloodless. Insufficient evidence, suspects unknown, investigation suspended indefinitely. No one protested the wording. The families of the dead learned to grieve quietly. Loud mourning invited questions. Questions invited scrutiny. And scrutiny, in that place, felt dangerous in ways no one could fully articulate. Some widows moved away. Others stayed and remarried. Children grew up with gaps in their understanding. Fathers explained away by silence or half-truths. Over time, the details blurred, but the emotional shape of the loss remained sharp. And then there were the brothers. They did not become symbols. They did not become martyrs. They did not become monsters in the stories told to children. They became absence. Absence is harder to resolve than death. Death closes a chapter. Absence leaves the book open on the table, pages fluttering whenever someone passes by. People claimed sightings. A man fitting one brother's description working construction 2 states over. Another seen at a bus station in Kentucky. A third rumored to have crossed into Canada under a false name. None were confirmed, none disproven. The lack of resolution did not create obsession. It created acceptance. Because what had happened did not feel unfinished. The men who had been hunted were gone. The men who had done the hunting had removed themselves from the story as completely as they had entered it. There was no victory to celebrate, no justice to prosecute, no spectacle to replay, only outcome. In the years that followed, small changes accumulated. Police interactions became more cautious, not kinder, but slower, more deliberate. Assumptions were checked before being acted upon. Authority still existed, but it learned the value of restraint. The bar where it had all begun was eventually demolished. The land sat empty for years before being sold again. When a new owner tried to build on it, construction stalled repeatedly. Permits delayed. Contractors quit. No single reason was ever given. Some places resist reuse. Older residents spoke less as time went on. Not because memory faded, but because language felt insufficient. How do you explain a moment when behavior changes without instruction? When fear teaches faster than policy? You don't. You let people notice. By the 1980s, newcomers sensed something without understanding it. A hesitation, a subtle recalibration of tone, the absence of certain behaviors that were common elsewhere. They adapted. Everyone did. The woods remained the most honest witness. Hunters avoided certain paths. Campers reported an unease they couldn't name. It wasn't fear of ghosts or superstition. It was awareness. The knowledge that the forest had once concealed movement with intent, not accident. Nature had been complicit, and nature does not forget its roles. In quiet moments, people replayed the beginning. Not the gunshots, not the bodies, the laugh, the casual permission of it, the ease with which cruelty had slipped into the room and been accepted as normal. normal. That was the true disturbance, because the massacre did not erupt from chaos. It emerged from order, from social rules functioning exactly as they had been designed to function. That realization settled deeper than any arrest ever could. A former deputy once admitted years later that the department never truly expected to catch anyone. "We were reacting," he said, "not pursuing. Reacting to the fact that something had already corrected itself in a way no institution could replicate." The word justice was never used internally. It was too clean, too optimistic. The word consequence fit better. Consequences don't negotiate, they don't argue, they arrive. By the time the last of the original witnesses passed away, the story had become quieter still. Younger generations knew only fragments, a sense of caution passed down without explanation, a cultural muscle memory. They learned where not to linger, how to read rooms, when to stop, not out of fear, but out of awareness. That distinction mattered. The massacre did not create hatred, it exposed it. And once exposed, it became harder to pretend it was harmless. That is why the story endured without being told, because its lesson didn't require repetition. The absence of repetition was the lesson. Three brothers walked into a bar in 1971 and were reminded, in a single moment, how expendable they were considered to be. What followed was not impulsive, not chaotic, not misunderstood. It was structured, it was targeted, it was finite. And when it ended, it left behind a region that understood something it had refused to acknowledge before, that power does not belong exclusively to those who believe they own it, that silence is not neutrality, and that disrespect, when repeated long enough, accumulates weight. Eventually, that weight must move somewhere. The brothers never returned. That, too, was deliberate. They did not stay to watch the ripple spread. They did not linger for recognition or fear. Their departure ensured that the event could not be simplified into a manhunt with a clean ending. No arrests meant no trials. No trials meant no speeches. No speeches meant no moral framing. The community was left alone with its behavior, left to decide what to do with it. Most chose restraint. Some chose denial. But no one chose repetition. That may be the most lasting outcome of all, because in the decades since, no similar event has occurred there. Not because hatred disappeared, but because it learned it was not consequence-free. The massacre did not solve anything, but it ended something. And endings, even brutal ones, changed trajectories. Western Virginia never memorialized 1971. It absorbed it, and absorption is how landscapes remember, quietly, permanently.